Some of it I do because I find it intellectually challenging and exciting and demanding, and some of it I do because I just feel it has to be done. So, people are suffering bitterly throughout the world. There are a lot of things we can do about it, and that seems to me a responsibility that comes with privilege and freedom, which we have to an unusual degree, maybe unique degree, to involve ourselves in these issues.
What do you think of the United States?
Well, I think it's a complicated country. It has wonderful achievements. It's in some domains, it's gone beyond any other country in the world. Protection for freedom of speech, for example, many other liberties. It's got tremendous advantages. Incomparable. Had the biggest economy in the world over a century ago. I don't think it's used them properly. There's plenty of many of the actions that the U.S. government has taken in the world, I think, are deplorable and should be stopped and reversed. You can't really comment on a country. There's just too many facets to it. There's a society, there's a culture, there's just too many things. I mean, when I take my grandson to a baseball game, as I did last Sunday, I enjoy being part of mainstream America. When I look at U.S. government foreign policy or the domestic, highly regressive domestic policies, I'm extremely critical.
Noam Chomsky will be with us for just a little under 3 hours, and we will go to the phones in the next several minutes. But for the first part of this program, we want to chat a bit about his life. Philadelphia played a big role in your life. What year were you born?
I was born in 1928 in Philadelphia, a immigrant, first-generation immigrant family, Jewish. My parents were very much involved, in fact, immersed in the Jewish community, Hebrew culture. My father was a Hebrew scholar, ran the Hebrew school systems. My mother taught in it, deeply committed to Zionism. We have to remember that that was something different then from what it is today. Actually, I grew up in a community in which we were, for most of the time, the only Jewish family in a mostly German and Irish Catholic community, and there were a lot of problems, which incidentally my parents never knew about, but the streets were complicated places.
Problems for you that
Yeah.
they never knew? Give us an example.
Well, as I say, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in those. This is the 1930s, deeply anti-Semitic period. I don't like to say it, but I grew up with a kind of a visceral fear of Catholics. I knew it was irrational and got over it, but it was just this street experience. There were periods these were periods of complex ethnic conflicts in the cities. There were times when I was a young teenager where in Philadelphia there was a curfew, I think a 7 or 8 o'clock curfew on teenagers. If we wanted to go out in the evening, we had to have parental authority. There were times when the walk from the subway station to the Hebrew school was under police guard. And it wasn't just Jews were not, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but it went in all directions. Actually, you get a pretty good picture of it from some of the novels written about the period describing urban ethnic conflicts, which are complicated and real. Grew up in the middle of them.
Where had your parents come from, and what were they like?
My father had come from Ukraine right before the First World War, escaping the Tsarist army. My mother had come from what's now Belarus. Her family, she came when she was a baby, actually. But and the two families were we're first-generation immigrant families.
What were they like? What were your parents like?
Well, I had a very warm, loving childhood. I look back at it with a lot of warmth and affection. They were both working. They taught Hebrew school, so I was in school actually from all day from the time I was about a year and a half old. I was actually in early years up to high school in an experimental school that was run by Temple University, a Deweyite school. Wonderful place. I don't know if there's anything like it today. It fostered creative activity. There was no competition. Actually, I didn't know I was a good student until I got to high school, because the question never arose. You weren't graded by your achievements. I mean, I knew I skipped a class, but I didn't think anything particular of it, and nor did anyone else. It was a very healthy, exciting intellectual and social environment.
Why did you decide to go to the University of Pennsylvania, where you got, I believe, your undergraduate, your master's, and your PhD?
Question never arose. You didn't go in, the idea of leaving home was inconceivable. We were working students, both my wife and I. You lived at home, you went to the local school, worked in the afternoons. The concept of going away to college just wasn't in the, didn't exist. The question never came up.
When did you first get interested in linguistics?
That was sort of accident. Well, it's complicated. Actually, my father was a Hebrew scholar. He did work on medieval Hebrew grammar, and growing up as a child, I read his manuscripts and drafts of the book and so on. I was kind of intrigued by it. But then I happened through political contacts to meet Zellick Harris, who I later discovered was the most important and influential linguist in the country. He happened to be teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. I was actually on the verge of dropping out of college at that time. I was pretty bored with it. I got in at 16, and a lot of anticipation and excitement, and was mostly killed in the first year. And I was not really committed to staying. I met him, and he drew me back into college. I suspect in retrospect that he was doing it on purpose, but I don't know. Anyhow, I started taking his graduate courses, and through his influence, other, also mostly graduate courses in other fields. And he was an extremely brilliant and exciting person in many respects. And my interests developed through those contacts, and then on from there.
When did you meet your wife, Carol?
She was about 2 years old, and I was about 4 years old, I guess. These were closely knit communities. She was also from a Jewish community. Her father and mother were from European immigrants, and the families knew each other, and we had sort of met as children, and they went through a kind of similar history, Hebrew schools, Hebrew camps. By the time we were teenagers, we interacted in a different fashion. We married pretty young. She was 19. I had just turned 21.
There are people that say there are two Noam Chomskys, as you know, the linguist and the political activist. Which one of those do you prefer?
Well, I can't really say. If the world would go away, I would be very happy to keep to what's called my professional work, linguistics, philosophy, cognitive science, and so on, which I do find exciting, exhilarating, challenging, and demanding, and easily could easily put my full-time activities into it. On the other hand, the other activities in their own way are difficult, rewarding, complicated, also challenging, and necessary.
Again, if you've just joined us, our guest for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes, Noam Chomsky, who is now located at MIT. How long have you been there?
Almost 50 years.
What year did you go there and why?
I went there in 1955, and actually at that time I had been at Harvard for 4 years in a graduate fellowship and had just gotten a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where I actually hadn't been for 4 years. I had no recognized academic field. The work that I was doing didn't fit anywhere. It didn't have any academic home. And I had no particular expectations of going on into an academic career, because for one thing, there didn't seem to be any possibilities. But I did receive an invitation from MIT to be in the electronics lab. I don't know a tape recorder from a telephone practically, and I know nothing about electronics, but I was the electronics lab at the time was directed by Jerry Wiesner, later became Kennedy's science advisor, who was a very imaginative person. The laboratory itself was a mixture of all kinds of exciting activities. A good deal of MIT at that time was in a transition from being primarily an engineering school to becoming primarily, in fact, totally a science-based university. It's a 10-year transition, which had a lot to do with things happening in American science and technology and so on. And the electronics lab where I was the center of a lot of these activities. Biology, neurophysiology, mathematics, linguistics, acoustics, just on and on. Many of these were experimental efforts. It wasn't at all clear that they were going to go anywhere. Some of them succeeded very well, others failed, but it was a great ferment of intellectual excitement and interaction and challenge. There were other places like it at the same time, for example, Bell Laboratories. And as I was primarily in the electronics lab in a research position, but I also was asked to do some teaching. I was able to teach introductory linguistics and philosophy courses, the first ones in these areas that had been taught there, but mainly my service to the university was teaching cram courses in French and German to graduate students who in those days had to pass a reading exam in French and German, which they considered a total waste of time because they knew they were never going to look at anything. And there was a technique for sort of getting them through the exam, essentially teaching them to fake their way through the exam, and that's the courses I was teaching for a couple of years.
On the screen is some shots of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is on the Charles River, right across from Boston, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. How many students there, do you know?
I think there's roughly, last time I looked, it was about 4,000 undergraduates, and I think about maybe twice that many graduate students, something roughly on that order.
My background on you says that you have published 65 political books and 33 linguistic books from a total of 60 different publishers. We have been doing book shows here for many, many years. I've never heard of anybody publishing 98 books.
Well, a lot of those books are collections of talks, interviews. If you looked at the ones I actually sat down and wrote, it wouldn't come to anything like that.
What was your first?
First book? The first book was called Syntactic Structures, and that was actually not intended for publication. It was notes for an undergraduate linguistics course at MIT, which at that time this material was basically unpublishable. It did not belong in any recognized field. I had submitted a couple of articles to journals which were returned. I'd submitted a book for publication, and it was returned, MIT Press, was returned with the sensible comment that this didn't seem to belong anywhere, and I ought to wait until the field exists before trying to submit a book, which was not an unreasonable comment. It did come out 20 years later. By then the field had been established. The first Syntactic Structures was actually notes, which a Dutch publisher who visited saw sitting on my desk and asked if I would put it together and let them publish it as a monograph, and they did.
What was your first political book?
First political book was American Power and the New Mandarins, which was a collection of essays, came out in 1969. It's just been reprinted. It was essays and talk, mostly, a lot of them based on talks, through the 1960s. Starting around 1963, I became pretty much involved in Vietnam War issues, and was giving many talks, usually to audiences of 2 or 3 people. There was absolutely no interest at the time. But over the years it built up, and by the late 60s there were way more invitations and opportunities than I could take up. I was also directly involved in activism and resistance. I have to say, for years, every time I came to Washington, the first thought that came to mind was the smell of tear gas. It was in and out of demonstrations, in and out of jail a number of times. The essays were a collection of, in the book, were a collection of talks, commentary, discussions based on these activities.
I have on my lap here a Norman Mailer book called The Armies of the Night, and up at the top is a picture of you back in 1967. What were you doing there at the Pentagon?
That was a big demonstration at the Pentagon in, I suppose it was October 1967. One of the first large-scale national demonstrations, not the first, but one of the biggest on a national level. Actually, Mailer and I ended up in adjacent cots in a detention center somewhere after we were arrested.
Over the years, lots of controversy, lots of books. We're going to go to the phones in about 10 minutes, and they'll have a chance to deal with these. But the other book that I have in my lap, and I've got a lot of your books, is one, it's a small one. It's called 9/11, and it was a bestseller. What's your main point in this book about 9/11?
Well, that book is a collection of interviews. It's a sample of interviews, and it happens to be just those that happen to be electronically stored. So, for example, it doesn't include interviews on BBC and so on. Right after 9/11, there was a massive requests from the United States and around the world for discussion of the events, their background, what they meant, what they were going to lead to, and this is a slightly edited collection of a number of those interviews. The point was, if there is a single point, that we should be aware of the role that we play in the world. What happened on 9/11 is a horrifying atrocity. It's probably the worst single act of large-scale terror that's ever taken place. I don't think there's another single case where thousands of people were killed in one act. On the other hand, for much of the world, the response to 9/11 was welcome to the club. We've been through this, and you've often done it to us. So, for example, I've forgotten whether I quoted it in there, but the research journal of the Jesuit University in Managua, Nicaragua, which is one of the main research journals in Central America, they published an editorial immediately after 9/11 describing it, as everyone did, as a horrifying atrocity, expressing sympathy for the victims, saying you could call it Armageddon. And then they added, but we have been through our own Armageddon in slow motion, under massive terrorist attack organized and directed by the United States. which led to tens of thousands of people killed and the country practically ruined and may never recover. So we do sympathize with the terrible atrocity that was carried out against you, but it's not unfamiliar to us. And that was a reaction through a good deal of the world. That's why if you look at there was an international Gallup poll taken shortly after September 11th. I think it was about September 20th, or roughly in that, about a week after, asking, this was at a time when the bombing of Afghanistan had in effect been announced, but it had not yet been undertaken, so it was in that interim period. And the question asked around the world was, do you support, what it said actually is, if the perpetrators of the terrorist attack are identified on that assumption, would you be in favor of bombing the place where they came from, their refuge? And then there were two questions. If it attacked only military targets, second, if it also hit civilians. It was never published in the United States, but the responses were interesting. There was very little support for the policy that was actually undertaken. And incidentally, we should say that they hadn't identified the perpetrators. But in Latin America, which is the region of most experience with U.S. domination and intervention, the support was extremely low. It ranged from about 2% of support in Mexico to about 11%, I think, in Colombia and Venezuela. The only marginal exception was Panama, which has a very an American component there. And even there, 16% supported bombing. I think 80% supported diplomatic means, efforts for extradition. And that reflects a history of experience, long experience. So yes, all over the world there was overwhelming sympathy for the victims, horror of the terrible atrocity, but a recognition that life's more complicated. We've been on the receiving end for a long time from European imperialism, which was violent and destructive, and from the U.S. variant of it. And I think it's only first of all, it's the merest honesty to face this. But if we're interested in reducing the threat of terrorism, which is enormous, if you want to really be frightened, read the recent Hart-Rudman sponsored study of the Council on Foreign Relations on terrorist threats to the United States, and they're pretty awesome. Well, if you hope to reduce and lessen these threats, you have to make a crucial distinction between the terrorists themselves, who are carrying out criminal acts, and you treat it like criminal acts, and the reservoir of in which their message kind of resonates, even among people who hate and despise them, but nevertheless recognize some authenticity to what they say. And it's that reservoir of, you can't really call it sympathy, but understanding, where real grievances lie that have to be dealt with. That's true no matter what kind of terrorism you're facing. If you want to reduce the threat, pay attention to the grievances from which they arise, and if they're legitimate, and they often are, deal with them. For one thing, because they're legitimate. For another, because it's just sanity if you're hoping to reduce the terror. These are topics discussed in the book, in their interviews.
Just tuned in. Noam Chomsky is our guest, and we're going to go to the phones. We have a call from Maryville, Illinois. First up, go ahead, please.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. I was introduced to your writings and works as an undergraduate about 4 years ago at the University of Illinois, and I was intrigued by your, by the straightforwardness that you had in your writings, and I first read them on ZNet. And anyway, my question, it's a two-part question. They're unrelated parts. My first question is, where do you attribute the incompetence of today's leaders in this country as compared to, the leaders such as FDR and, in the early 20th century, men of distinction and honor. I know, presidents like Andrew Jackson and some other ones were, not very honorable. But where do you attribute this? I mean, it's been decades now where we've had leaders, one after the other, just promote these policies and enact these these wars and these where do you attribute that to?
Thanks, caller. That's good.
Well, I'm not sure I would use the word incompetence. I mean, I think they're very competent. They know what they're doing. They're dedicated, committed. They even tell us very frankly what they're doing. So, for example, the national security strategy that was announced last September was a very clear, brazen statement of a program of sustaining world dominance by means of force, and announcing the intention to rely on force to suppress any potential challenge to that dominance. Now, that's quite a departure as a policy statement, and it sent many shudders around the world, including the foreign policy elite at home. But there's nothing incompetent about it. It's a very clear, explicit statement, frank statement. Why they're pursuing those policies? Well, we can look at them. But if we take an honest look at the past, it's not very pretty. I mean, we can ask, for example, why we're sitting where we're sitting. There were people here, after all. Lots of them, millions of them. What happened to them? Well, the Founding Fathers were pretty frank about it. They knew what they were doing. John Quincy Adams, for example, many years after his own very ugly contributions to this were over, did have a change of heart, and he condemned what they had done in what he called exterminating the hapless race of Native Americans with ferocious cruelty, or words approximately like that. They understood what they were doing. They cleared the continent. They conquered half of Mexico in a war which was bitterly condemned within the country. Correctly, it was a terrible war. A century ago, the United States conquered the Philippines, killed a couple 100,000 people. That good part of the military command ended up facing war crimes trials afterwards. There was bitter condemnation of that too. Mark Twain, for example, the leading, maybe the leading writer in the United States, wrote very bitter, sardonic anti-war essays, and we can go on. The history has not been a pretty one, and that's why after the national territory was conquered, power extended to the region. The United States was not a major actor in the global scene until after the Second World War, but it was regionally the dominant power in the Caribbean and Central America, extending to Hawaii, which was taken from its own citizens by force and guile, onto the Philippines, but particularly in Central America and the Caribbean. And those are not, if you take a look at the record there, it's not at all attractive.
Washington, D.C., for Noam Chomsky, good morning.
Good day. Well, there's more like 300,000 in the Philippines, and that's my point and my disagreement with Mr. Chomsky. It's too general, Mr. Chomsky. It has to be specific as a prosecutor and factually, and the facts are known. The body counts are well known, and everyone quotes them incorrectly. That's my disagreement with you. I like your work very much, and many people follow you, but I think you need to, if Hussein's criminal to be prosecuted, then our involvement and participation, and Helmut Kohl's involvement and participation in the 80s is a prosecutable crime also. And also our uranium war crimes, or the wars in Ethiopia. James Baker restarted in 91, and now 20 million Ethiopians are in risk of starving to death, and there's plenty of food in this world. There's no famine without war. This is the heart of the matter, and the generalizations goes farther away from it. Look at their faces, see them, and thank you for your time.
Well, I certainly agree with you that one should be accurate about the facts, and if you would like to bring up some specific questions about facts, I'd be happy to think about them, and if I made a mistake, to correct it. You're right about the tremendous suffering and agony throughout the world. Much of it it's not, it's by no means all the result of U.S. policy, obviously not. Problems in Africa are extremely ugly and complex. In the Congo alone, several million people have been killed in the last few years in wars that would not be easy to handle and deal with, though a good deal could be done about them. There's plenty of starvation. I don't think war is the only factor that lies behind famine. Often famines take place when, as you say, there's plenty of food, but social and political conditions are such that the food isn't getting to the people who need it. And there's plenty that can be done about that. The AIDS epidemic is devastating, not only Africa, but many other parts of the world. And resources, there are methods of treatment which require not huge sums of money. And we could dedicate ourselves, our portion of our resources, to dealing with that. We have ample resources, many of them being used in destructive ways. But your point is correct. There's all sorts of horrible things going on in the world. Some of them we're responsible for. And there we have a direct responsibility to terminate what we're doing and improve the situation. Others are things we could assist, and to the extent possible we have a responsibility to do that. There are plenty of others which are going to be well out of our control.
This book called Middle East Illusions is in the bookstores right now. It's by Noam Chomsky. As we go to North Andover, Massachusetts, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Well, Professor Chomsky, good afternoon. I'm honored to ask you a question. I have, when you said to us the grandson that you were able to enjoy a baseball game with last week, with your love of words and your love of linguistics, I was just curious if you ever had the opportunity to have any connection with Mr. Edward L. Bernays, who was a resident of Cambridge for the last 40 years of his life, was first in New York City, and was for almost 100 years connected with, very powerfully, the public affairs work of the American Tobacco Company, working with Guatemala for a war that almost was started because of bananas in the 50s, and all of these different media actions that I believe have really contributed to where we are now in our worldview of, we have got a corporate mentality of destroying what we don't like, taking it over, manipulation of it, because his learning from his uncle, Sigmund Freud, was utilized to his best ability with twisting people's view of what was good for them so that he could sell products to them.
Thanks, caller. Eddie Bernays.
Actually, you're right, he lived in Cambridge. We weren't that far apart. I never actually met him. But,
called the father of public relations.
Yeah. But I've written a fair amount. I've looked at a lot of his work, and in fact have written a fair amount about it. I suspect that it wasn't his Freud who was the big influence on him, but rather, in fact, exactly what he said. He said the major influence on him was his participation in the first state propaganda agency in the United States, Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, which was established in order to try to drive a basically pacifist population into support for the war that Wilson very much wanted to get into in Europe. And it succeeded. Within a short period of time, the propaganda efforts, they were called propaganda in those days, it was more honest use of terminology. The propaganda efforts of the Committee on Public Information, a very Orwellian name, did succeed in driving a pacifist population into raving anti-German fanatics, to the point where the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven, things like that. It drove the country into a kind of hysteria. And the participants in that committee included many people of subsequent great distinction and influence. Edward Bernays was one. Another was Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century and most important figure in American media. Both of them went through that experience and learned from it and wrote about what they learned from it. What they learned, as Bernays put it in a famous book of his called Propaganda, late 1920s, I think, he said that we have learned that the intelligent minorities can engineer consent through the use of manipulation, propaganda, and control. And we should do it for the benefit of the public. It's for the benefit of the public that we should control them and engineer their consent. Lippmann said pretty much the same thing. Also drawing from the experience of the wartime propaganda agency, he wrote important essays on democracy in the 1920s called Progressive Essays on Democracy. They were both liberals, kind of Wilsonian progressives. He said, well, we've learned that there's a new art in the practice of democracy, the art of what he called manufacturing consent. Bernays' term was engineering of consent. And this is very significant because the public should not be participants in the democratic process. They should be spectators, not participants. They are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, as he put it. And for their own benefit, we, the intelligent minority, the responsible men, must control them. Bernays' particular significance, this had all sorts of influence all over the place, but in the intellectual culture, in political science, and so on. But Bernays' particular influence was exactly as you say, and he was one of the founders of the modern public relations industry, which grew into a massive industry right at that period. Had it existed before, but it became very important after at this time. And its goal was to control attitudes, beliefs, to marginalize people, to induce, to drive them towards what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and keep them out of the public arena where they don't belong. Bernays' first major achievement was a program that convinced women to smoke cigarettes. Women didn't smoke in those days, but he had an elaborate public relations program, including models walking down Fifth Avenue, to show, with cigarettes, showing this is what modern women are like. And it did succeed in turning women into smokers with a toll that we need not discuss. The Guatemala case, you're correct. He was the public relations, he ran the public relations for the propaganda effort to support the overthrow of the democratic government of Guatemala, which led to horrifying atrocities which the country is still suffering from. This is one of the examples that we should be anything but proud of, and he did play a role on that. He did a lot of other things. He's famous at Cambridge for a campaign to save the sycamores on Memorial Drive, which was again a successful public relations campaign that many people admired.
Springfield, Massachusetts, for Noam Chomsky. Hello.
Good afternoon, Professor Chomsky. My question to you is, do you believe that a nation should suffer a detrimental cost in order to compensate for wrongs committed by the governors of that nation or by segments of that nation in the past?
I'm not sure exactly what the question means. Are we if you're living under, let me see if I can understand it. Suppose you're living under a dictatorship, and the dictators carry out some horrendous act. So you're living in Stalinist Russia, let's say, and Stalin carries out horrible crimes. Are the people of Russia responsible for those crimes? Well, to only a very limited extent, because living under a brutal, harsh terrorist regime, there isn't very much they can do about it. there's something they could do, and to the extent that you can do something, you're responsible for what happens. Suppose you're living in a free democratic society with lots of privilege, enormous, incomparable freedoms, and the government carries out violent, brutal acts. Are you responsible for it? Yeah, a lot more responsible, because there's a lot you can do about it. And therefore, the cost of if you share responsibility in criminal acts, you are liable for the consequences.
Jacksonville, Florida. Good afternoon.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. It's an honor to speak to you, sir. I'd like to have you address the idea of 9/11 as like a false flag or a let it happen on purpose kind of situation. I mean, it's not exactly unprecedented in American history, or world history for that matter, especially given the Project for the American Century, where Paul Wolfowitz said that it would take like a Pearl Harbor-like attack on America to be able to implement their plans. And could you address that for me, please?
Well, I know that's a widely held belief. Frankly, I'm personally extremely skeptical about it. I don't think there's any likelihood that an action like that could have been planned, and I don't really think there are any historical precedents for it. If the White House had been in any way involved in planning this, it would have been an act of absolute madness on their part. For one thing, you could never tell where it was going to go. For another, it would certainly have leaked. I mean, it's inconceivable that a plan of that nature wouldn't have leaked. And it just doesn't make any sense, in my opinion. And I don't think the evidence is at all compelling. I've read what there is. You're quite right about the exploitation of it. When it happened, it was exploited, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So, for example, the Russians were exploited September 11th as they saw it as a window of opportunity to step up their really brutal repression and violence in Chechnya, presenting it as a struggle against terrorism and expecting to get authorization from the United States, the world ruler, which indeed happened. Israel used it as a window of opportunity to step up repression in the occupied territories, claiming it's a war against terror. China did the same in Western China, where they're carrying out, again, harsh repressive activities against dissident, sometimes rebel groups, again expecting U.S. authorization, which they got. All over the world, governments, including more democratic governments, used it as an opportunity to impose more discipline on their own populations. So yes, it was recognized throughout the world by state power as an opportunity to increase repressive actions that were underway, to impose discipline and so on. But that doesn't mean that all those countries planned it. They just recognized it as a window of opportunity. And I think the same was true here.
If you've just joined us, we have about 2 hours and 15 minutes to go on our in-depth program on this Sunday afternoon with Noam Chomsky. Next call, Peoria, Illinois. Hello.
Hello. I'd like to question the effectiveness of demonstrations, and especially civil disobedience, in effectively changing U.S. policy. In the Vietnam War, it dragged out for 17 years. Public opinion turned against the war in 1968, yet the war dragged on for 7 more years, and the opinion polls and public opinion research showed that the public, even though they hated the war, they hated the demonstrators even more. So that just prolonged the war. And like we have a march here in Peoria, a rally against the war in Iraq. We had 200 marchers. We got 5 inches in the newspaper, 1 little inch of new information why people should be against the war. You're never going to be able to demonstrate in the street, get coverage like that, and get your message across. You had to do direct door-to-door literature dropping, stuffing doorknobs or canvassing door-to-door to get your message out with a full sheet of paper with all your arguments. The media is not going to do your job for you. They're not get your message across in the detail and the full expression that you like to see. Maybe letters to the editor even would be more effective than the demonstration, because demonstrations just go an inch, and letters you just get maybe 4 or 5 inches of full explanation of what you're doing. And in Illinois, during the Vietnam War, we were much more effective in electoral politics with McCarthy and George McGovern. In fact, the Democratic Congress caucus in the House voted against funding for the war, despite the fact that McGovern lost, that McGovern had just demonstrated enough strength in election districts across the country at the grassroots level that the congressman knew that next time up they would see challenges to the congressional seats in the congressional districts where McGovern successfully elected delegates. They saw the handwriting of the war. They voted to cut off the funds in the Democratic caucus in the House. And the day after that, Nixon signed the peace treaty and ended the war. So that was the effective way, electoral politics. But here, people, I went to a Chicago teaching for peace and justice yesterday, and they're chortling over 10,000 people blocking one street in Chicago. And they're using that as a big victory. But the government could easily use an alternative street, run tanks down the street to mow people down. That's totally a symbolic victory. These demonstrations don't accomplish anything. In Illinois,
Pierre, I'm going to let you go. Thanks. You made your point.
Well, one part of what you say I completely agree with. Just demonstrations, not connected with day-to-day ongoing educational and organizing activities, are pointless. But take the case of the Vietnam War, which was dragged out. In that case, I think the evidence is pretty strong that the demonstrations were very effective. They were part of exactly what you're suggesting should be done. They were part of day-to-day organizing educational activities, and the demonstrations grew out of them, stimulated other people to join, made other people understand what was happening, contributed to the activism, which ultimately, after many years, led to the appearance of political figures who were willing to become, the leaders of or the official leaders of what was by then a mass popular movement. And that was after years and years of very hard work, including demonstrations. And I think there's very strong evidence that they were successful. If you want to have some direct evidence for it, in 1968, after the Tet Offensive in January 1968, the business world turned strongly against the war because it was becoming very costly to the United States. It was becoming costly because Lyndon Johnson was never able to call a national mobilization of the kind that was called during the Second World War, which led to a very efficient economy. He wasn't able to do that because there was too much discontent. They had to fight what they called a guns and butter war, which led to stagflation and economic problems. The discontent was the result of activism, including demonstrations. Johnson was essentially, it was a real power play from the business world. He was essentially told to call off the war after the Tet Offensive, which indicated it was going to go on for a long time. He wanted to send 200,000 more troops to South Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were opposed. The reason, they said, was because they thought they would need the troops for civil disorder control in the United States, where large segments of the population were just getting out of hand. They mentioned women, youth, minorities, others. This is in the last part of the Pentagon Papers, worth taking a look at. The disorder and the discontent revealed themselves in many ways, demonstrations being a very visible part, but much more than that. And the appearance of politicians, Eugene McCarthy's a good case, was much later. And only when there was a mass base for it, then the politicians appeared. Before there were a few. Grinning and Morse were two, but very few until a mass popular movement had developed. And I don't really agree with you about the demonstration. I mean, it can be, if it's not done properly, yes, it can be destructive. You can say that about anything. The demonstrations on February 15th around the world were so, they're the biggest mass demonstrations in history, I suppose. They were so significant that actually the New York Times, a little unhappily, in its comment on them, said a day after that there are now two superpowers on the planet. One is the United States, meaning the U.S. government. The other is world public opinion. Well, world public opinion was visible on February 15th, and that led to the recognition that there's a powerful force there that has to be dealt with. It didn't stop this war, but there's never been protest like this against a war at that stage. You're quite correct in your account of how long it took to build up protest to the Vietnam War, which actually started in 1962. This protest was before the war had actually started. That indicates a major change in consciousness and understanding in the country, and it's the basis, I think, for developing significant popular movements which will impede and, I hope, reverse the use of violence in world domination and control. But it doesn't happen in a day. And your point about day-to-day explanation, work, leafleting, and so on is absolutely correct. Unless that's a central part of the activity, demonstrations don't mean anything.
Jerusalem, Rhode Island, good afternoon.
Hi, sir. Anti-terrorism bills were rushed through Congress in the days after the Oklahoma City bombing and have been extended since September 11th. The problem is that clearly some of those bills had been written and printed before the bombing. Already the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force has issued flyers urging the public to call for information about possible terrorists, defenders of the U.S. Constitution, and those people who would make numerous references to the Constitution or attempt to police the police and lone individuals. I believe this is an undermining of basic democracy, and I believe that the FCC rule change that is proposed for June 2nd that would allow the media companies such as Clear Channel Communications to be able to purchase newspapers will limit the free press. As a novelist, I believe that you probably also support not allowing these large media companies like Clear Channel to be able to purchase newspapers on top of radio stations, since 2 out of every 3 households are reached by 6 major media companies. As a novelist, do you support the free press, or do you support this media rule change that Mr. Powell, Michael Powell, who is the son of the Secretary of Defense Colin Powell for some unusual reason, but it has been alluded through Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center disaster, written by David Icke, what that relationship between Mr. Powell and Michael Powell and the government's hidden agenda to eliminate basic civil liberties are. Do you support this media rule change by the FCC?
Thanks, caller.
Yeah. Well, on the specific question of the, you brought up many interesting points. On the specific question of the FCC ruling, I'm on your side. I don't think that, I think that the planned ruling will increase the tendency towards centralization and monopolization of media, which is a very bad thing. It's been going on for years. Quite apart from this, the major monitor of the study, the regularly published study which deals with this, is Ben Bagdikian's book, The Media Monopoly. I think the first edition of it must have been about 20 years ago. And he then identified, if I remember correctly, about 50 major concentrations of media in the country. The last edition, which was a year or two ago, I think it was down to under 10, and the FCC ruling will reduce it even further, not in the print media, but including the print media, in fact. And I think it's a very bad thing. We want as diverse a press as we can get. I don't think that's the only problem with the press at all, but it's a problem. On the other issue that you raised about anti-terrorism legislation and civil liberties, here I think we have to be, we have to have a certain caution. Terrorism is a serious issue. I mean, personally, I don't object when I pass through security at the airport. I think that's, you could argue about the details, but that something should be checked makes sense. On the other hand, the Justice Department, the Bush Justice Department, has claimed rights which are incredible. If they are implemented, it is a major attack on civil liberties, and to an extent they have been, and to an extent they've even been upheld by the courts. I mean, they've claimed that the executive has the right to imprison people, including citizens of the United States, to hold them without trial, without charge, without access to family and lawyers, and to do so indefinitely until the president declares that the war on terror is over, which means indefinitely. There's a new act under discussion, Patriot 2 it's sometimes called, which includes provisions that would grant the Attorney General the right to actually withdraw citizenship, rescind citizenship, on what's called inference. The Attorney General's inference from some pattern of behavior that the person supports terrorists. I mean, this is utterly outlandish. No free and democratic society should tolerate anything remotely like this. There are, what's happening on Guantanamo is absolutely shocking and has been condemned by every human rights and civil rights organization throughout the world, and maybe getting worse. I don't know, can't authenticate it, but there are now reports in the British press and Australian press that there are plans for, and it's been the British Foreign Office has agreed that it's correct, that there are plans to have execution chambers in Guantanamo where people can be executed without anything remotely resembling a fair trial on charges that, and without proper legal representation or anything like that. These moves are really shocking, and we should be, you're right, that we should be deeply concerned about them. I might quote, if I can remember the wording, a comment by Winston Churchill about this. Churchill's bust is on George Bush's desk. He looks at it every day. Churchill described, he said that something like this, to place a man in prison without charge and without the judgment of his peers in a fair trial is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist. Churchill said that in 1943 when he was opposing efforts to institute preventive detention for alleged intelligence purposes. And in 1943, Britain was in pretty dire straits. It was under attack by the most vicious and murderous military machine in history, and its survival was not obvious. Nevertheless, he took that position, which is correct, and he's right. What's now being proposed is, and in part implemented, is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian societies, whether Nazi or communist, and we should be deeply concerned about that.
Here's some of the 98 books that Noam Chomsky has published over the last, I guess what we're talking about, almost 50 years. American Power and the New Mandarins, a new foreword by Howard Zinn. This was 2002 when it came back out. There's one called World Orders, Old and New by Noam Chomsky. Remember the year this was out?
First published in 1994, and there's an expanded edition in 1996.
And here's another one, Deterring Democracy. It was a national bestseller. Can you still buy this one in the stores?
I don't know if it was a national bestseller. I doubt it.
That's what it says right up at the top.
Well, you should know never to believe anything that's put by a publisher on a cover. That was 91, extended 92.
Most of these still in print?
Yeah.
Carlsbad, California. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Yes, sir. I'm a military officer with 25 years of experience who's read Mark Twain's War Prayer. And I got a couple of quick questions for you. And I'd like to know whether or not you think it's perfectly natural for a country to protect its borders and guide its national interests, whether they be protecting the population against terrorism or securing economic interests. And in the case of radical Islamic terrorism, that we might have had to burst the terrorist bubble in the wake of a failure of diplomacy. And that wasn't necessarily our failure, looking at their motive, intents, and consequences. And that's the first part, if I could come back to you after that.
Well, should a country have a right to defend its population and its economy? Yeah, certainly. I don't think that's a question. I didn't exactly understand what you meant about the Islamic terrorism.
Well, given the war in Iraq, that we were over there perhaps in the face of radical Islamic terrorism.
No, there's no, look, that was a fabrication. There is no evidence whatsoever. I mean, Iraq was Saddam Hussein's a horrible monster. just as he was when he was supported by the United States, the people now in office in the 1980s. He was a hideous monster. Osama bin Laden is another hideous monster, but they're different monsters, and they hate each other. And there's no evidence whatsoever for any meaningful evidence of a connection between Saddam Hussein's horrifying regime and the networks like Al-Qaeda. They despise each other and have had no known connections. The only effect of the war in Iraq on terror is that it has, as predicted, increased recruitment for Al-Qaeda. So it's increased the threat of terror, exactly as predicted by intelligence agencies in the United States and throughout the world and other specialists. But the idea that attacking Iraq had something to do with the war on terror is just mendacity.
Quick follow-up, Carlsbad.
Yes, sir. Thank you. With respect to foreign policy and the potential for peace in the Middle East, do you think that first world countries, which have a tremendous ability to provide resources and aid to developing countries, can promote peace in the face of Arab humiliation and overcome Israeli defensiveness?
Well, we have to ask. There's here I think we might listen to the leading specialists on the topic, namely from Israeli intelligence. So the former chief of Israeli military intelligence just pointed out in a book in Hebrew that until Israel is willing to treat Arabs with respect as human beings with rights, there will never be an end to terror. 20 years earlier, a former head of Israeli military intelligence, Yoshat Harkabi, said essentially the same thing. He said, until we deal with the legitimate grievances and demands of the Palestinian people under military occupation, there will always be the threat of terror. He was writing at a time when Israel was virtually immune from terror from within the territories. Just in the year 2000, the head of the Israeli secret police, Shabak, the general security services which control the occupied territories, essentially said the same thing. He said, until we deal with the legitimate grievances and demands of the Palestinian population under occupation, we will never put an end to terror. So the humiliation is there, and the degradation is there, and the repression is there, yes, it does lead to sometimes to terror, certainly opposition. And incidentally, if we want to look ourselves in the mirror, as we should, this goes way back. George Bush is not the first president to ask, why do they hate us? Almost 50 years ago, President Eisenhower, in internal discussions with his staff, which have since been declassified, discussed what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not by governments, which are on our side, but by the people. And his National Security Council gave an explanation for it. They said that there is a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports corrupt and oppressive regimes which block democracy and development, and that we do it because of our interest in controlling the oil reserves of the region. And furthermore, they said that perception is correct, so it's very difficult to counter. And they said, yes, we have to continue doing it. You hear the same feelings expressed today, even by wealthy Muslim managers of multinational corporations. They perceive the United States correctly as supporting brutal, corrupt, repressive regimes that are blocking democracy and development. And yes, that leads to antagonism and often hatred. It's not the source of Osama bin Laden, but it is the reservoir of background that the heads of Israeli military intelligence and the secret police were talking about. We have to be serious about that if you want to stop terrorism. I mean, the same is true elsewhere. Take, say, Northern Ireland. As long as the British responded to IRA terror with just escalation of violence, it increased the terror. When they came to the point of beginning to deal with the legitimate grievances, it did improve the situation enormously. It's not a utopia, but it's much better than it was 10 years ago.
Stamford, Connecticut, for Noam Chomsky. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Chomsky, I share your views and revulsion at much of U.S. foreign policy, and I think you're right. Once you understand it, it's irrefutably cruel, evil, and ruthlessly self-interested in many, many, many instances. And I find you to be an invaluable voice of criticism and dissent, yet your views almost never appear in the mainstream media. Do you feel you're censored at some level by the mainstream organs in this country?
Well, I wouldn't call it censorship. You're right that I don't appear in the mainstream media, and not just me, but the same is true of other critical voices. The media do, in fact, reflect a pretty rigid and, I think, narrow spectrum of opinion. And if you don't belong to it, you don't appear there. It's not censorship, it's their choice and decision.
Sharon, Pennsylvania, you're on with Noam Chomsky. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I have some disagreement, but most agreement with you. And one of it's in the point that I feel you don't go far enough. For instance, just on the last point, for instance, NPR. I've read that even when you're speaking to a smaller audience at American University, from which NPR broadcasts this Diane Rehm show, you've been barred from that program, even when you were very conveniently to be interviewed. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the chairman of NPR is the former head of all CIA propaganda foreign broadcast, and the head, for instance, of PBS is the former head of Voice of America. Now, when you've got that on the supposed alternative to the corporate media, the big business media, which is interlocked and owned by military-industrial weapons manufacturers and colludes with the CIA, I think there is quite a bit of censorship. And I do read your stuff on ZMAG.org, like a previous caller, and it's very useful, and I think that it doesn't go far enough in many cases. For instance, you claim that somehow it's not plausible that the administration or a faction within intelligence supporting the administration had prior knowledge and saw that the only one that would benefit from this attack in 9/11 would be the warmongers within the Bush administration and the police state factions within the Ashcroft Justice Department. I think is belied by the fact, and this gets to the media, that James Bamford, the top NSA expert who wrote the book Body of Evidence, points out from declassified State Department and Pentagon documents that in the early 60s, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Undersecretary of Defense had plans to terror bomb American cities, murder American citizens, even bomb an American ship in Guantanamo Harbor to frame up Cuba, to blame Cuba for these U.S. Government planned bombings, and then use it as a pretext to invade. Now, there is a real precedent there. It was only called off by the Kennedy administration because apparently they figured that it might go awry. But it shows that there are these clones of this very fanatical ultra-right faction, almost duplicate at that time within the high levels of government that correspond to this Bush administration with its plans for world domination.
Thanks, caller. Mr. Chomsky.
Well, what you're referring to is Operation Northwood. It's declassified. You can read it if you like. It was a contingency plan called at the request of the Department of Defense, and it did have roughly the character you described. But if you look at contingency plans, they are all over the map. They've got plans for everything, and it was not implemented. And it wasn't the only one. There were other plans that came from the more liberal sectors of the Kennedy administration. For example, plans to stage what would look like a Cuban invasion of Haiti, which could then be used as a basis for invading Cuba. Actually, that one came from Arthur Schlesinger, way over at the liberal end. But from looking at contingency plans by governments, I don't think you can conclude very much. On the 9/11 event, you have to make a crucial distinction between two things. The earlier question, at least as I understood it, was whether the Bush administration was involved in planning it. For that, I think it's outlandish. The question you're asking is whether there could have been foreknowledge of it. Well, that's conceivable, but then we have to be a little cautious, because remember that in 1993, almost 10 years earlier, there was an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center, which came very close to succeeding. And if it had succeeded, would have caused tens of thousands of deaths. deaths. Since that time, there was no doubt in the intelligence community that operations of this kind were possible and might take place. Whether there was any foreknowledge of this one, I haven't seen any convincing evidence of that, but it's conceivable.
In a moment, we're going to take a break, and our guest, Noam Chomsky, is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with a BA, an MA, and a PhD. Got out of there in 1955, has been at MIT since 1960?
55.
Actually 55, and has published a total of 98 books over these years. You have 3 children, Diane, Avi, and Harry?
That's right.
Where are each of them today? What are they doing?
Avi's the oldest is teaching at Salem State College near Boston, Latin American, specialist in Latin American history, teaches history. Diane, our second daughter, is happens to be in Mexico at the moment, but is primarily living in Nicaragua, where she's been about 15 years, has her family there. Our son Harry, the third child, is living in the Bay Area, works in software engineering, that kind of thing.
We have about an hour and 45 minutes to go, and we'll be back with Noam Chomsky and more, and your calls in just a moment.
About 10 years ago, the United States had the highest wages in the world, which is what you'd expect. This is the richest country in the world by far, and it has absolutely unparalleled advantages. Real wages have in fact stagnated or even declined for the majority of the population since their peak around 25 years ago. But in the mid-'80s, the effects of the double-edged so-called conservatism of the Reaganites namely markets for the poor and state protection for the rich, that hadn't yet had its full impact. By 1993, the impact was quite obvious. The Wall Street Journal was able to exult over what it called a welcome development of transcendent importance. Namely, U.S. labor costs had fallen below all other leading industrial powers, apart from England. We actually did fall below England for a while, but then Margaret Thatcher succeeded in driving the working people and the poor down even more efficiently than us. Meanwhile, profits were rising to new heights. Earlier this year, every year, Fortune magazine has the big business magazine, has a review of the Fortune 500, the 500 top guys. And earlier this year, they reported dazzling profits, that's their word, for the 500 top corporations, even though sales were stagnating. So wages are going down, sales are stagnating, and profits are zooming to dazzling heights. Sometimes called a paradox. In fact, if you look at social policy, it's not terribly paradoxical.
Watching Professor Chomsky there from 1994, and he's here in our studios for the next 1 hour and 45 minutes, and we've got calls waiting to talk to him. This one from Omaha, Nebraska. You're on the air, Omaha. Please go ahead.
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. I think it's in line with what was just shown, a little talk you were giving about economics and stuff. I've been pretty deeply interested in socialism over the past 12 years, and I keep hearing that socialism is on the rise again in the U.S., at least within the universities and stuff. They say, always saying how all the faculties, out east and west are more and more socialistic, and I guess I see as kind of the root of all the evil, all this, imperialism and capitalism, economics, creating all these, wars and terrorism, blah, blah, blah. I'd like to hear more of your commentary on, the potential or what's going on, realistically now in the U.S. and the world in terms of a true socialistic movement, in terms of like the working class really taking charge of economics potentially, rather than all this, to me, is what's screwed up versions of what is called socialism, through tax cuts and blah, 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 that they're going to redistribute, that's what you get through the mainstream media, that they're going to create tax cuts and redistribute it, and that's what they call socialism.
Thanks, Omaha.
Well, the tax cuts are a curious kind of socialism. I mean, the tax cuts are intended to, and having the effect of redistributing income even more toward the rich than is currently the case. In fact, the tax cuts are pretty clearly part of an effort to destroy the progressive legislation of the past century, including social spending in general, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, progressive taxes, and so on. That's virtually conceded. I don't know how closely you've been following the business pages in the last couple of days, but it's been revealed that the former Secretary of the Treasury, before he was fired, commissioned a study by the top government economists, Treasury Department, Bureau of the Budget, and so on, to estimate the likely effects of the Bush administration economic programs. That includes a vast increase in federal spending, primarily for the military, which means high-tech industry in general, and tax cuts directed primarily towards the most wealthy sectors, enormous tax cuts. They estimated deficits on the order of $44 trillion. That's a lot of money. That was supposed to be put into the February budget proposals, but didn't appear there. There's a debate about whether that was purposeful or not. Anyway, it's now revealed and conceded. The White House spokesperson, Ari Fleischer, was asked about it in a press conference a couple days ago, and he said, yes, the figures are correct. And then, paraphrasing him, he said something like this. He said, this means that Congress will have to be responsible in reforming Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. Now, the kind of reform he's talking about is not funding it through reinstituting progressive tax measures, but basically killing it. They know that they cannot approach the population in an election on a platform saying we're going to eliminate social spending and transfer wealth even more to the wealthy than it is today. But they can, and I think are intending to, drive the country into what a number of economists have called a fiscal train wreck, which will then have the effect of eliminating social spending. So this is about as remote from any this is it's government intervention on the for the benefit of the wealthy. Now, as far as socialism is concerned, that term has been so evacuated of content over the last century that it's hard even to use. I mean, the Soviet Union, for example, was called a socialist society, and it was called that by the two major propaganda operations in the world, the U.S., the Western one, and the Soviet one. They both called it socialism for opposite reasons. The West called it socialism in order to defame socialism by associating it with this miserable tyranny. The Soviet Union called it socialism in order to gain whatever, to benefit from the moral appeal that true socialism had among large parts of the general world population. But this was about as remote from socialism as you can imagine. I mean, the core notion of at least traditional socialism is that what you mentioned, that working people have to be in control of production and communities have to be in control of their own lives and so on. And you know, this goes, the Soviet Union was the exact opposite of that. Working people had no control over anything. They were virtual slaves. And the collapse of the Soviet Union is, in fact, a small victory for socialism, in my opinion. It eliminated one of the major barriers to it and should have been recognized as such. But the term has been, as I said, become so meaningless that it's hard even to use. If we use it in the traditional sense, which you brought up, that goes straight back in American history. You read the working class press in the mid-19th century, press published by artisans and what were called factory girls, young women from the farms working in the textile mills in eastern Massachusetts, which was the center of beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Their press was calling for, they said their theme was that those who work in the mills ought to own them. Wage labor, which was called wage slavery, was regarded by most Americans as not very different from slavery. Even the Republican Party regarded wage labor as just at best a preliminary to free labor, but intolerable because it's a kind of servitude. A large part of the northern population fighting the Civil War was fighting under that banner. This goes straight through the 20th century, the idea that people should be in control of their own destinies and lives, including the institutions in which they work, the communities in which they live, and so on. Call it what name you want, but that's traditional socialism. And there are today attempts to describe a kind of a detailed vision of the future based on these notions. The most extensive and detailed one I know is by Michael Albert at ZNet, which you mentioned. It's participatory economics, and there are other such proposals. But I think this is deeply ingrained in people's understanding and consciousness, and barely below the surface. In fact, it's a call for essentially extension of democracy to the industrial sphere and to communities as well. We should also bear in mind that the leading American social philosopher, John Dewey, who's as mainstream as apple pie, his main work was concentrated on democracy. He pointed out over and over again that as long as we have what he called industrial feudalism, that is a tyrannical private power controlling production commerce, democracy will be very limited. We have to move to what he called industrial democracy if we hope to have significant democracy. As for politics, his position was that until that happens, politics will be the shadow cast over society by big business. And I think most of the population recognizes that and accepts it.
New York City, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes, hello, Dr. Chomsky. I heard you refer to your early experiences with Zionism. I imagine a more universal and idealistic Zionism from that period. And I was wondering if you could speak on the evolution of your relationship with Zionism and the State of Israel. And also, perhaps if you could speak on what your vision might be for an Israel maybe drawing on that more optimistic early Zionism, and how the process of getting to that vision differs from Oslo, Clinton, and Barack in 2000, and now the roadmap.
Well, this will have to be brief, but in this book that was mentioned before, Middle East Illusions, there's a lot of discussion of that. Some of the essays there go back to over 35 years, up to the present. But to try to put it briefly, at the time when I was a Zionist youth leader, an activist back in the 1940s. But for me, Zionism meant opposition to a Jewish state, and that was a recognized, accepted part of the Zionist movement. By no means a majority, but it was a position within what was called the Zionist movement, opposition to a Jewish state. And I think the reasons for that were good. The same reasons why I'd be opposed to a Christian state or a white state or an Islamic republic. Same reasons. A state should be a state of its citizens and not of some privileged category of its citizens. And the State of Israel, incidentally, by High Court ruling, is the state of the Jewish people in Israel and in the diaspora, but not of its citizens. And I'm opposed to that. I've always been opposed to it. So in that respect, my views haven't changed. If this was merely a matter of symbolism, it wouldn't matter much. So the fact that the United States has a day off on Sunday, okay, doesn't make it a Christian state in any sense that matters. But if there were special privileges for Christians or whites or others, it would be a different matter. Then I think we should be opposed to it, and that's true in Israel. After the establishment of the state in 1948, which the issue of the existence of Israel was essentially over as far as I'm concerned. It should have the rights of any state in the international system. I don't think states have many legitimate rights, but that's another story. But whatever rights you accord to any state in the international system, okay, Israel should have those rights. It should be democratic internally, meaning the state of its own citizens, not of the majority of them and other Jews elsewhere. After 1967, the situation changed radically. In 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, Sinai, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. And since that time, this is now the 36th year of a quite harsh and brutal occupation, in which time Israel, when I say Israel, I mean the United States and Israel, because just about everything Israel does is by U.S. authorization and with U.S. Diplomatic, military, and economic support. They can't go much beyond what the U.S. authorizes. And what they have done is move to integrate the West Bank, particularly, into Israel to the extent that they want it. So there are massive settlement programs which have broken the West Bank into cantons, effectively. And to get quickly to the Clinton-Barack programs at Camp David, they were you should take a look at the map of what was proposed. It's rather striking that while there was much talk about how magnanimous and generous the offers were, you can't find a map. I don't think a single map appeared in the American media. They were available. They were in the Israeli media and Europe, standard scholarly sources, and so on. But they didn't appear. If you look at the map, you can understand exactly why the settlement was completely unacceptable to the Palestinians. It broke the West Bank into effectively 4 virtually separated cantons, north, central, and southern, with a little part of East Jerusalem, the center of Palestinian commercial and industrial and cultural life, separated from the 3 virtually. A few connections, but difficult ones. And that program has, that's a settlement program that was conscious, continued rapidly under Clinton and Barack. It's continuing even more under Sharon and Bush. And it is undermining the possibility of a meaningful political settlement. If you ask what the future ought to be, in my opinion, here I happen to agree with about 2/3 of the population of the United States, according to polls, and almost the entire world. There has to be a preliminary settlement on approximately the international border. It's the pre-June '67 border, with some adjustments because of changes since, but mutual adjustments. Actually, Clinton's chief negotiator, Robert Malley, discussed this in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, and he said what makes sense, I think, that there have to be effectively 1-to-1 land swaps, which would be the basis for at least a political settlement that would lay the basis for an end to violence, integration of a peaceful integration of Israel into the region as its leading industrial and financial center, but just part of it, without further conflict. If that stage can be reached, and there is an overwhelming international consensus on that, and strong popular support in the United States, the U.S. has been blocking that for 25 years. It's part of the illusions that are talked about in the title of that book. If we can get to that stage, then the further questions you're raising come up. How about, there will be serious problems of democratization both in Israel and in the new Palestinian state. My own feeling remains pretty conservative. It's what it was 60 years ago, that the long-term, I don't think it makes much sense to break that territory into 2 parts. If you know the area at all or have traveled there, you can see it's awfully artificial and harmful. In the longer term, I think there should be moved towards some kind of federal structure, ultimately as relations, let's hope, improve among the people and nationalist sentiments are subside and hatred subside, moves towards closer integration as circumstances permit.
We're at about the halfway point with our in-depth with Noam Chomsky. He is a professor at MIT in Cambridge. Here's a look at the outside of his office building where he works, and eventually you'll see where his office is inside. How much time do you spend there?
Usually 3 full days a week.
What days?
Well, for some reason, my classes for many years have been on Thursdays. So Thursdays classes, Tuesdays and Fridays appointments, interviews, other things.
How many classes a year or different courses a year do you teach?
Well, technically I've been retired for the last couple of years, but this year I had 2 courses at MIT and 1 half course at another university, State University of New York.
How much are you speaking?
I can't even remember. Almost constantly.
I mean, do you go on the road a lot still?
Quite a lot. I arrange the timing so that I can be on the road, obviously, on days when I don't have commitments at work. A fair amount. Yeah.
I want to take a number of calls. If you don't mind, make some notes here so we can hear some voices of people that are watching. And we'll go through a couple of these here, and then we'll come back to and have you wrap up some of the comments on their calls. New York City next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hi, Dr. Chomsky. A couple of things, and I'll try to make this quick, but a couple of the challenges that you pointed out, the United States being the only superpower and having a much larger role and responsibility in the global community. Some of the changes that need to happen, and going back to the earlier caller's points on sort of socialistic philosophy. I mean, the good for the all is the way I would look at that. It seems to almost oppose the foundation of the United States being more of a capitalistic system where it is profit-driven. And maybe I'm drawing too big of assumptions, but it seems like we're more in a plutocracy than a democracy. And a lot of the people who are in a position to make those changes on behalf of the United States also have special interests in their ears from the industrial society, or that's probably propagating a lot of the industrial feudalism, as you've mentioned, and thereby also creating some of the frustration, the antagonism, and resentment against the United States, resulting in terrorism, as we've seen it. So how do you see something like this changing when you've got sort of a disinterested public, or a public that's kind of being kept out of the whole process, and about to be even more so with further media consolidation? So just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
We go to Fall River, Massachusetts. What your question or comment?
Yeah, Professor Chomsky, you had already answered my question. But it seems to me you're really holding Israel to a double standard. You say nothing of the fact that no Jews can live in Saudi Arabia or Jordan, but you hold Israel to such a standard. And also, Jewish people cannot visit the Temple Mount. And but when Jews control religious areas, they're supposed to make it available for everybody. So could you address that? Why do you hold Israel to a double standard?
Thanks. Denver, Colorado, what do you have to say today?
Yes, hi. I just wanted to thank you very much for having Noam Chomsky on the show. This is a great honor, and one of the most important writers in history. But I just want to present a hypothesis, and I would like him to address this. Do you think the recent Sharon move to refer to the O word, as people say, and what appears to be all roads leading to Tehran, as far as military action, do you think the Bantustan, you'll see the point I'm making, do you think the Bantustan model prevailed in Israel? And do you think this was an effort to sort of neutralize the Arab opposition? Because I think it appears to me that the inevitable move for military action will be against Iran, probably within the next year or so.
One last one, and then we'll come back to Dr. Chomsky. We go to Palo Alto, California.
Good morning, Professor Chomsky, or I guess it's afternoon where you are.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions about 9/11, about the terrorists. The terrorists somehow prevented the U.S. Air Force jet fighters from being scrambled in the normal 10 minutes, and they caused a delay of 75 minutes for the jet fighters to be sent up. And they hit the Pentagon with a guided missile because if it had been one of those airliners, there would have been about 100,000 pounds of aluminum out on the lawn there, and that could not possibly have vaporized the way the government said it did. And somehow the terrorists arranged those cell phone calls, and that's been shown by experiment to be impossible. And somehow those terrorists put explosives in the World Trade Center buildings because Columbia University seismographs showed pulses that could only have been caused by explosives at the beginning of the fall of each of those buildings, not as they were actually falling. Now, all of these things, you can read them, for example, at cosmicpenguin.com. That has links to 55 different websites containing information about these facts.
All right, sir, thanks. There's a lot there, but maybe you can summarize some of it.
Okay. Maybe the easiest way is to go backwards. That's okay. Yeah. Well, the last caller made a number of technical observations, which I'm completely incompetent to comment on. I have no idea whether there were seismographs that showed that there were explosives in the building, and frankly, I'm extremely skeptical. The fact that a lot of material appears on Internet sites is not very compelling. The Internet is a very valuable instrument. You can learn all sorts of things from it, but anybody can put anything they like up on the Internet. That's part of its value, and you have to evaluate the information. I haven't checked any of the technical issues that you discussed, so I can't comment on them, but I should say that I have extreme skepticism about them. On Sharon, Iran, the caller right before, Sharon the O word, namely occupied territories. Actually, the word he used is conquered territories, which is pretty strong and accurate. And the road to Tehran and the efforts to neutralize the Arab world. Here, I think we have to be we have to look closely. The Sharon plan and the Bush plan, as far as we have any information about them, is simply a continuation of the Bantustanization process. If you read the Israeli press, which has excellent reporters like Amir Haas and Gidon Levy, who write about this all the time, what they're describing and what you see if you go to the West Bank is just breaking it up into cantons. I mean, the separation wall, which is going from north to south, has already encircled a Palestinian town, Qalqilia, and is virtually destroying it. It was just announced that it's going to go to the east, to settlements to the east, Ariel and Emmanuel. There's a story in the New York Times today about the settlement of Itamar, which is even to the east of that. Whether that'll be included in the separation wall or not, we don't know, but it's a salient, which was in the Clinton-Barak plan that basically cuts the northern sector from the rest. There is just no doubt that the separation wall or some equivalent will include the vast settlement and infrastructure programs to the east of Jerusalem, extending almost to Jericho, which cuts it again. And those there's a growing city there, Ma'ale Adumim, which was established primarily in the Clinton-Barak period, pretty much with the purpose of bisecting the West Bank. And it's got infrastructure connections to Israel, which essentially break up the Palestinian territories. That plan, as far as we know, George Bush's vision, as he calls it, as far as we know anything about it, is simply a kind of program which is called a Bantustanization program in Israel for good reasons.
Would you say that word again?
Bantustanization. I mean,
it stands for?
That's a reference to the South African programs of the early 1960s of setting up black homelands, which were called Bantustans. Chomsky was the first. There were several others. They were never recognized by anyone. But their idea was to set up black states under black leadership, surrounded by white areas. And it was one of the most grotesque efforts of the apartheid regime in its worst period. That's been regarded as a model by Israeli planners pretty openly. And it's discussed in those terms, criticized in those terms usually. But it's not unreasonable. I mean, it's a cantonization program, setting up cantons which have some connection, but not much, and are basically unviable. Is that an effort to neutralize the Arab world? Yeah, I think your suspicion is correct, but it's certainly not going to work if it's anything like that program. As for Iran being the next step, it's certainly being set up. And there's, unfortunately, the United States is creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, it's very likely that the war in Iraq will inspire Iran to develop weapons of mass destruction. In fact, that's been predicted by intelligence agencies and analysts all over the world, including the United States, that this plan, the national security strategy, the plan to crush by force any potential challenge to U.S. domination, is virtually demanding that potential adversaries create some kind of a deterrent. And the only kind of a deterrent they have to a state with overwhelming power is either terror, which is a deterrent, or weapons of mass destruction, or, as in the case of North Korea, massed artillery aimed at Seoul and at American forces there, which are a deterrent to attack on North Korea. But, you know, when you announce your intention to rule the world by force and to crush any potential challenge, you're virtually, you know, demanding that potential adversaries do something about it. And Iran might move on to develop weapons of mass destruction, which will then be used as a pretext for an attack. However, I personally don't think there's going to be an attack on Iran. The reason is that Iran is not like Iraq. Iraq was defenseless, completely defenseless, and that was known. and that was a prerequisite for an invasion. Iran is not defenseless. I mean, it doesn't begin to compare with the United States in power, but it's not defenseless in the sense that Iraq was. And for that reason, I suspect an attack is unlikely. On the other hand, subversion is not at all unlikely. And according to some American academic specialists who've written on the topic, there are underway efforts to stir up subversive activities and stimulating. Iran's a complicated country, stimulating some nationalist elements like Azeri in the north to build up breakaway movements. It's reported, I can't verify it, by academic specialists that a good part of the Israeli Air Force, over 10%, is permanently stationed in eastern Turkey, presumably at American bases there, and is flying regular reconnaissance over at the Iranian border, probably either for surveillance or intimidation. Whether this is happening or not, I don't know. It's reported from credible sources, and I think something like that is much more likely than a direct attack. And this is contrary to the wishes of the countries of the region and the countries of the world, who have been trying correctly to support reformist tendencies in Iran. These efforts undermine them, and to step by step integrate Iran back into the international system on healthy terms. There are strong reformist tendencies. They have plenty of barriers, but they should be supported, not undermined. So that what you described could be the planning. We don't know. You know, we don't have access to internal plans. But what is the information available suggests something like that. As to Israel and a double standard, I don't quite agree. As I mentioned, I'm just as strongly opposed to the so-called Islamic republics, of which there are a number, which are not states of their citizens, but are dedicated in principle to Islamic rule. And some, like Saudi Arabia, are horrendous. It's one of the reasons why I've been strongly opposed to strong U.S. support for repressive and brutal states like Saudi Arabia for many years. When Eisenhower and his staff were talking about the campaign of hatred back in 1958, they were referring to U.S. support for states like that, oppressive states that have all sorts of horrible legislation, including what you mentioned, and are opposed to democracy and development, and the U.S. shouldn't be supporting them. It's part of the reason for opposition to U.S. policies throughout the region. So I don't agree that that's a double standard. The first question is a complicated one. What kind of a country is this? Well, you know, that's for its people to decide. Take, say, the existence of corporations. That's a major part of our society. We're a largely corporate-run society. Where did corporations come from? And corporations were given the rights of persons about a century ago by courts and lawyers, not by legislation. That's a sharp blow against the classical liberal principles that the country was established on. I mean, Adam Smith or James Madison would have turned over in their grave at the idea that an abstract entity like a corporation is given rights of persons of flesh and blood, like freedom of speech and freedom of search and seizure and so on. These are these are collectivist legal fictions, as they're sometimes described in the legal literature. They're basically tyrannies, controlled from top to bottom. There's the idea that they should have rights of persons. From a classical liberal point of view, the view of the Founding Fathers, is just outlandish. They now have rights far beyond persons. So the recent trade agreements, so-called trade agreements, not really trade agreements, they grant corporations rights that go far beyond persons of flesh and blood. General Motors, for example, can go to Mexico and demand national treatment meaning to be treated like a Mexican business. But a Mexican of flesh and blood can't go to New York or San Francisco and demand national treatment. It wouldn't get very far. This is a complete reversal and a sharp attack against the liberal principles, the capitalist principles on which the country was founded. What about the political system? The political system is really what political science is sometimes called a polyarchy, not a democracy. That is a system of elite decision and public ratification. That's what, go back earlier in the discussion, that's what people like Lippmann, Bernays, and others were talking about. And it has good constitutional sources. If you look at James Madison, who was the main framer of the Constitution, his view, explicit in the discussions of the Constitutional Convention, is that power, as he put it, should be in the hands of the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men, the people who have sympathy with the rights of property, meaning property owners. And he argued strongly against democracy. He gave the model of England, which is, of course, what they were thinking about. He said in England, if the population really had the vote, the majority of the population would vote for a better distribution of the wealth of the society. At that time, that meant land. In other words, they would vote for what nowadays we would call agrarian reform, to give, break up the concentration of land and give it to people who needed it. And Madison concluded that's intolerable. We can't accept it. So therefore, we can't accept a system in which the population will, in fact, have a direct say in social and economic policy and affairs of state. The population should be fragmented, and power should be in the hands of the wealthy who basically are concerned with property rights. Well, that's not the position of the population of the United States. And over the centuries, there have been many struggles about this. It's a large part of American history is struggles about these issues. What the country is founded on and what it should be the matter for the people to decide. You pointed out, the questioner correctly, that the population seems, I think the word you used was disinterested. I don't really believe that. I think the population feels helpless. They feel there's nothing much they can do about it. In fact, attitude studies show that. There's a measure called helplessness. Can we do anything about what's happening? Now, that's been going up in recent years. I think it reached its peak the last time it was studied, about the year 2000. And people do feel helpless. They feel that the government is not doing anything for them. So, for example, in the last presidential elections, 2000, right before the election, so no Florida shenanigans and so on, about 75% of the population didn't take the election very seriously, regarded it as some kind of game involving rich contributors and party bosses and the public relations industry, which crafts candidates to say things that maybe will pick up votes, but that don't let you know where they stand on issues. Issue identification was extremely low in the 2000 election. Most people couldn't tell where the candidates stood on most issues. And it's not because they're stupid or incompetent. It's because the election is crafted that way. You're supposed to vote on what are called qualities, not issues. Part of the reason for that is that on major issues, popular opinion and elite opinion happen to be sharply divided. And those issues just don't come up in elections. And I think at some level, the population, much of the population is quite aware of this. I don't think it's lack of interest. I think it's a feeling of lack of ability to do much about it. But that is but if we want to improve the situation in the country, and I think we should, that's the opportunity for activists, organizers, people who want to empower people and enable them to do things. And it certainly can be done. We do have a legacy of freedom. It hasn't been a gift. It's the result of struggle. It was won We can use that legacy of freedom if we like, or we can abandon it. But those are choices.
For Noam Chomsky, Farmington, Michigan.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. And thank you for the opportunity. I think you answered part of my question regarding Iran, and I had a follow-up. With Bush administration increasing the rhetoric and bringing the drama of war against Iran, I wanted to know your opinion on U.S. policies on Iran and what can Iranians do to confront, in one hand, the repressive regime at home and, in another hand, the possible U.S. invasion of Iran.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's I mean, the situation in Iran is extremely difficult within Iran. It's pretty clear that a substantial majority of the population wants to pursue the reform measures which will undermine the power of the a clerical autocracy. And the setup of the country makes that hard. Legislation can be passed, reformist legislation, but then it has to be ratified by the clerical authorities, and of course they always turn it down, so they veto all the reformist legislation. And they've got force behind them. They have military force, paramilitary and military force. So the population is facing a difficult internal situation. Now, that situation, we can help the reformist movements, or we can hinder them. We're hindering them by threatening invasion. That simply gives credibility to more authoritarian and harsh and brutal elements. If a country is under a threat of attack, that's what's going to happen. We see it right here. The way the Bush administration has used the threat of terror, which is real, to impose authoritarian measures and to control the population in ways which are unacceptable. And the same is happening in Iran, of course. Efforts from the outside to help through diplomacy, through commercial relations, through trade and so on, to integrate Iran into the region and the world, that's the best thing we can do to help the progressive reformist elements in Iran, which do want to turn it into a more free and democratic society. We can't solve the problems for them, but we can improve the conditions under which they can deal with their own problems. And it's not going to be easy for them. They're facing harsh internal constraints.
About an hour to go on In Depth with Noam Chomsky. It's Spokane, Washington. Hello.
Hello, gentlemen. First, Dr. Chomsky, I would like to thank you so much for elucidating all of the problems of political arenas around the world for me. In contrary to a speech you gave, one that I saw at a community center, I'm an international affairs student and economics major, and I'm a senior. And so there are a lot of international affairs majors that I'm very much interested in your opinions. Early on in the program, a gentleman called from the military, and he stated, don't you feel that a country should protect its population and its borders as well as its economy? And you said yes. However, from all of the speeches, sorry for the sounds in the background. Yeah. For all of the speeches that you've given, I'm a little curious. One, in stating that yes, you feel that a country's economy should be protected, you are inherently stating that yes, we should send the military to enforce the rules of a corporation. And a corporation, of course, now, and unfortunately in this country, being seen as an entity, actually having, as you said, more rights than an individual, you are saying that it's okay.
Yeah. Well, in that case, I was speaking not very clearly. I understood the question to mean, does a country have a right to protect itself from attack? Okay, so if someone attacks from abroad to, say, destroy American agriculture and industry, does the country have a right to defend itself? Yeah, I think it does. But maybe I spoke badly, but you're interpreting what I said as meaning, do we have a right to send the military abroad to enforce the domination of U.S.-based corporations. No, of course, that's not defending the economy in the sense that I had in mind. So I think I'm in agreement with your point, if I understand it.
Got some more books, some of the 98 books you've published in your life. Here's Noam Chomsky, Pirates and Emperors, Old and New, International Terrorism in the Real World. New edition. What year was this originally put out?
The first one, which was just Pirates and Emperors, was 1986, right in the middle of the Reagan-Bush War on Terror, as they called it. Remember that the War on Terror was redeclared on September 11th, not declared. The first one was 20 years earlier. And it was just reissued with new essays bringing it up to date since 1986.
Here's another one. Forward by Edward Said, Fateful Triangle, updated edition, the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians.
Yeah, that was written in 1983, right after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And it was updated in 1999 with a number of essays and articles about the intervening period.
Here's a little younger Noam Chomsky, Understanding Power, the Indispensable Chomsky. What year did this come out?
That one I was really surprised at. I didn't know that that material existed. It's mostly from transcripts of lengthy discussions and interchanges, if I recall, from about 10 years ago.
Actually, this particular version is 2002.
Well, it was published then.
Yeah.
But I think most of the material in it is from an earlier period. The two editors, Peter Mitchell and John Shuffle, did a fantastic job of, I don't know how they did it, of finding discussion transcripts, material, putting them together. They also put on the internet. There are no footnotes in the book. They put the footnotes on the internet, and it's really their footnotes. They have elaborate sources, backgrounds, extensive material. It's a terrific reference. I use it all the time.
Norton, Virginia, go ahead, please.
Good afternoon. I consider it a great honor to be able to speak with Dr. Chomsky, and I'm so impressed by what I've just heard that I have a difficult time formulating my question. What I wanted to ask about is in his capacity as a linguist. Do you think, Dr. Chomsky, that a lot of the repression and abuses of power that we're seeing going on, and terrorism included, is a fear of goddess energy? And do you know goddess, the female?
Goddess energy.
Goddess energy. Oh, I see. I didn't hear it. Yeah.
In regard to the Gaia hypothesis.
Yeah. Well, first of all, as a linguist, I have absolutely nothing to say about this. There's no professional, special knowledge that bears on your question. Tell you the honest truth, I don't really have anything to say about it. I'd be interested in knowing what you think.
Not there.
Since
Atlanta.
you've obviously thought about it.
Go ahead, Atlanta, you're on the air.
Hi, appreciate it. Thank you, C-SPAN. Mr. Chomsky, thank you for being on the show and doing your best to be a great American. What the founders were, in Hayek's words in Constitution of Liberty, what Hayek thought he was an old Whig, as opposed to the modified Whig that showed up in the 1830s, which was part of the manufacturing of a new sense of what we were. But in your book about Rethinking Camelot, to be a patriot rather than a court dissident, I think you have to look to the actual documents, the proof of senior Bush complicity in the CIA's assassination of President Kennedy, and to suggest that there was no change when we went back to Federal Reserve notes from Kennedy's U.S. notes, as well as the 58,000 who subsequently died in the Roman colony of Indochina, trying to preserve the interests of the 5% Catholics who own 95% of the wealth, is denying a thread in the tapestry of history that the Jews and the Gentiles that founded this country knew about, that was embodied in Jefferson's letter to Samuel Kercheval, identifying the real Antichrist as this engine for enslaving mankind, which is exactly who the corporations that you apparently rail against now represent around the world. I mean, this is the oil industry is Roman Catholic. Cheney and Rockefeller are merely their hired help, and the Bush family funded Hitler. That's what put him on the front of Time magazine as Man of the Year. And you I understand your reticence to speak to the facts, but when we know we can send up a hue and cry and go after Bush for his complicity by the FBI documents, Kitchell's document of November 22nd, 1963, which you can get, Hoover's document, which Bush denies, but which places him in the CIA a week later, as well as the court case Hunt versus Liberty Lobby, that the jury determined the CIA, in fact, committed the crime. I think a person of your stature has an obligation to the country, particularly at your age, none of us got here alive, to call a spade and say what's true if we're going to be a righteous land and the land that all of our ancestors believe this country should be.
Well, I agree with you. We should call a spade and say what we think is true. In the book, most of what you talked about I don't know anything about, so I won't comment on. But the specific thing that you did raise, my book, Rethinking Camelot, I wrote it because there had just been, the State Department had just released extensive documentation about the early 1960s, a period which I'm very much interested in connection with Vietnam. It supplemented the mass of information that was already available from the Pentagon Papers and many other sources. When the Pentagon Papers came out, that was an unusually rich source because that was not declassified material. It was material that was not intended to reach the public, so it's kind of like capturing some country's archives. So that was unusually rich material. I was involved in it to some extent and wrote about it right away. That's this book, For Reasons of State, that was mentioned, is mostly about the Pentagon Papers. The new book, Rethinking Camelot, was about this, included the subsequent documentation. In my view, I'm calling a spade the way I see it. The documentation, which is unusually rich, demonstrates as close to conclusively as you can come in matters of history, which is always uncertain, but demonstrates very persuasively that John F. Kennedy was a hawk on Vietnam. He wanted to get the troops out, but so did everyone, but only after victory. He made that very clear and explicit. There is no indication in the documentary record that I can find that he had any intention other than that. And there is furthermore no indication of any significant change after the assassination. The policy continued on course, same people directing it as under Kennedy, pretty much the same people, pursuing the same programs. As conditions changed, their tactics changed, but there's no reason that I know of to believe that he would have done any differently. And the same on other issues. The assassination was a crime and an atrocity, but the idea that there was any kind of high-level conspiracy behind it seems to me extremely unlikely on the basis of any evidence I can discover, and I've looked pretty hard.
Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Good afternoon.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Professor Chomsky. I agree with most of what you've said in the past and in this program as well. I have three observations to make that I've collected over the last few months.